So, hi everybody. Welcome to our session on patient experience data in regulatory processes. We will use the acronym PET probably very often during this discussion, so patient experience data. So this is actually a discussion, and you can move to the next slides. Just to put that in the context of co-creation, I let our speakers explain a little bit how we came to co-creation, but just to maybe introduce it a little bit, we had some discussion, and with all the progress made on the regulatory front in terms of patient engagement in the last few years, some people were pointing at the patient experience data. And actually that started with discussion around the coffee, then some discussion in meetings, and then in some places it shaped as a proper project. And so what's happening today is that actually we are bringing together several of these discussions. And so that's how co-creation starts. It's really one person that's kick off everything for everybody else. And that's actually the meeting point where we can start co-creation and come to you with some first thoughts and some data already. So next slide, please. So today we have three speakers. So we have Eleanor Perfetto from the National Health Council. She has been traveling all night in a train, and actually the train has not arrived yet. So she will be joining us very quickly. And I will take the start of the presentation for her. We also have Dr. Jessica Scott. She's head of R&D patient engagement at Takeda. And she's one of the initiators of this track on patient experience data. And she will tell a little bit more about a story. And finally, we have Wendy. Wendy has a very diverse background. She started in industry. She also was a senior scientific advisor at NIH in the US, and the same with the FDA. And she has more recently joined Deloitte, and I've been supporting some part of the generation of data that she will present to you a little bit later today. So in terms of the agenda, next slide, please. So in terms of the agenda, unless Eleanor is joining us last minute, the idea was to start with actually the patient perspective. And all the work that she could represent, whether it was led by NHC or by other patient community representative in the US mainly. And the idea was maybe just to give a quick word to say on how important it is. We'll see if she is able to join. And then making maybe a step back where Jessica will present to us a little bit her journey and how she came to this as an issue first, and how she actually started to address it, and how she arrived to this table, to this round table. And then Wendy, a little bit later, will actually go through the results of some data we would like to share with you all, which is the result of interviews to try to better understand the issue, where we start from and what we actually face. So we can finally, in our panel discussion at the end, we can start to shape, okay, how do we approach this? What needs to be done? In what order? And so we can start to co-create. So next slide, please. So just the last check to see if Eleanor is present before I go on that part. Just don't see nothing on the chat for me, so I will go. Okay, so basically, the idea for today, if you can go to the next slide. So you will have a bit of introduction. You will have a bit of presentation. But the idea is really to start getting your thoughts already. So we have a team moderating the chat. Feel free to already push your questions already make your comments, share ideas. We will capture all of that. Not necessarily all of it will be shared live. So our presenter can remain focused on the content of the presentation for the first part, but everything will be kept and could be discussed in the panel discussion just after. So stay very tuned because we will have some questions for you and we'll make it as interactive as possible. Use the chat, please, if you want to make comments. Next slide, please. So in terms of objective of this session, so we want to co-create, but actually the people that are bringing some content to the table actually have been thinking about that and working on that and exploring the issue for a little while. So the first goal is actually to share that. And so there is a learning objective. But then we want to explore, okay, what does that mean? What are the challenges? What are the challenges that are specific to this very topic about patient experience data in regulatory processes? But also maybe what's common to all aspects of patient engagement beyond that specific issue. And then from there, we will start to exchange, and the idea is to start to shape what are the next steps. We have the opportunity to continue that. You will have the opportunity to express your interest in joining co-creation or simply to be informed as we progress. So all of that is really aimed at creating a co-creation environment in which you feel comfortable to contribute and actually to benefit after that from all the work we have done together. Next slide, please. So we will have a tool. We will use a polling tool today. So if you could, on your phone, or if you can actually, you can see in the chat, you have the link to it. So on your phone or on your main computer, if you're using a laptop, if you can go to www.polef.com/PED2020. Please enter your name. Be reassured that your responses will be anonymous. And actually keep an eye on your screen because we will have some various questions when time has come across the presentation. So what I am wondering if we have a first poll now, just as a test. We can go maybe to next slide. Yes, you should have a poll live on your screen. I will give it a few seconds for all of you to actually enter how you feel today before we actually enter the deep discussion on patient experience data. I'm not sure, I see on the chat, I'm not sure the poll is working. It seems it works. I'm surprised we have not more tired people. We are close to the summer. We had a super heavy period to get here. It's increasing now. Really good. You're excited and ready. A huge majority. That's very nice to see. Seems numbers are not evolving that much. So let's go to the next poll maybe. For moderators, I have a question from Lode the Wolf, who would like to see how many people are actually answering the poll. I don't know if you can give that information in the chat, maybe. Now, which type of audience do we have around the table today? I can see Lode is disruptive in the chat. You too. Thank you. So we have so far a huge majority of biopharma profiles around the table. Welcome. We know, and actually Jessica will share about that, we know how important it is and how an issue it is to actually know what to do, when to do it, and how to do it. Regulators, 5%, 14% of patient organizations, consultants, and 8 others will be good, maybe as a will be good to see how we progress. I see your comment, Rosalind. Welcome. It's good to see you're there. The numbers don't seem to change that much anymore, so I suggest we move to the next slide. So, Jessica, I think if you would be great if you could explain a little bit what's your journey on this question, where it's come from, and where you are going, basically.
Thank you. Thank you, Nicola. That was, it's wonderful to see the live reactions, and we've really built that into this workshop, even though we're conducting this virtually. So at Takeda, we've done a good job of conducting patient engagement at an organizational level by consistently implementing activities across the global program teams and developing roadmaps for how we'll engage with patients and the patient community through clinical development and beyond. The insights are informing our internal decision-making and are really of tremendous value. But that's not enough. The problem is that the insights are not also being communicated consistently with regulators and are therefore not informing regulatory decision-making. What we need to do is to develop clarity about when and how to bring these insights to regulators. Historically, we have had a very diffuse view of the patient experience because it's been through third-party information. We've had it communicated to us through the HCP or physician community or through literature. Now, we can see more clearly by directly hearing and experiencing that more directly through the patient experience, by patient engagement and interactions that we have with in-depth two-way dialogue that helps us really understand and experience more firsthand with patients what their experience is like. Their unmet needs, their priorities really come into focus, and we gain an understanding of what truly matters to them. And here's what we're doing at Takeda. We've shifted our culture to one of patient engagement by embedding consistency throughout the organization by requiring key performance indicators, metrics, to ensure that we're consistently implementing patient engagement activities throughout our global program teams. And in fact, we're also moving from this evolution, which started a few years ago, to by the end of 2020, 100% of our global program teams having a proactive roadmap, as I mentioned, for bringing the patient and patient community into the process of drug development. So these insights have been hugely impactful for us in informing drug development. And we want to share these insights with regulators at the right time and in the right way in order to enhance their decisions as well. Let me go to a few examples. One of our global program teams wanted to understand what mattered most to people living with Friedreich's ataxia, which is a progressive and debilitating neurologic disorder impacting lower extremities first and then migrating upwards into the hands. Well, traditionally, the endpoint used for clinical trials in Friedreich's ataxia included the 6-minute walk test. That's been what's been required by FDA in order to measure the efficacy of an interventional therapy, investigational medicine. But what we heard when we engaged with the Friedreich's Ataxia Research Alliance and actually had individuals living with the condition involved as ad hoc members of our study team, advising the team on what really mattered most to patients, we understood that actually hand function and fine motor skills were more important functions to maintain as long as possible than the gross motor skills in walking. And that's because many people are already in a wheelchair and could benefit from a potential new medicine that could prolong the use of the hand function. So we looked at the 9-hole peg test. Initially, this wasn't accepted by the FDA. However, when the Friedreich's Ataxia Research Alliance held a patient-focused drug development meeting and invited the FDA, we weren't there. The FDA saw through the lens of patients and accepted the 9-hole peg test as a new primary endpoint for the trial. Now, this was a little circuitous in how it evolved, and it would be optimal to balance the resources and the contribution of patients' resources to communicate directly with the right information in a way that was well received by the FDA in order to base decisions on changes like the primary endpoint. Let me give you another example. We engaged patients for feedback on a study design for a potential new medicine in celiac disease. There haven't been a whole lot of trials in celiac disease, so we really wanted to understand what the patient perspective was in thinking about a study design and what would be acceptable in terms of a level of burden. And what we learned was that the amount of gluten that's typically required in a gluten challenge to measure efficacy was a much higher dose of gluten than these individuals felt they could tolerate. This is another example of critical information regarding the study design that needs agreement from regulatory authorities, but how to communicate that information, those insights, in the best way possible, other than just indicating a change in the study design. How do we share that evidence of the patient perspective in a way that regulators can base decisions off of? It's not clear, exactly how and when to do that. So I recognize that there are many patient engagement activities where we have valuable insights that are informing our decisions, but it's not so clear how we can share those insights. And I wondered why that was. So I started to look externally and read a really interesting article by Kiefer et al. From Sanofi titled "The FDA Reported Use of Patient Experience Data in 2018, Drug Approvals." This article, published last year, was really the first article to summarize what was required by the 21st Century Cures as a patient experience table that would need to be published as part of the review package and analysis in terms of what FDA looked at, but not necessarily the value placed, and the consistency across divisions was not evident from this review as well. I started to think about whether there were some organizations, some other sponsors that were doing this well and had figured out the best path for communication, and was really interested in understanding if there are some emerging good practices in this space that we could learn from. And understanding that it wouldn't be really possible for me to get a clear sense from potential competitor organizations what they were doing and have them feel comfortable sharing the details. And that's why I contacted Wendy at Deloitte, knowing her background and experience, having been at the FDA for over a decade and also having worked in industry. I was just really interested in some aggregated information that could help us all understand from the emerging best practices and whether or not others thought that this was a gap. And in my collaboration with PFMD, I brought this concept into discussions with Nicola and others at PFMD and other organizations through an informal network that we have, and there was interest in progressing this work. And so we started to work collaboratively and think about what we needed to do and the stepwise approach. And we brought the National Health Council and Eleanor Perfetto, who will be speaking as well, into the discussion to think about this together and begin to progress forward in a collaboration. We're 4 different organizations, but very much aligned toward the goal here. We come together in our desire to bring more medicines of value to patients and to do so in a more expeditious way and honoring the time and energy that patients and patient organizations spend in educating us along the way. And so I'm here to expand this collaboration together with my colleagues to all of you as well. The purpose of our discussion and our workshop today is really to hear from all of you, to set the background of the learnings to date. We've had 60 stakeholders identified, 35 interviews already, and we've categorized the emerging themes. And here we are today to share with you and to understand any gaps, any other perspectives to gauge your level of interest in moving things forward together. It is our hope to collaborate with you in enhancing the communication pathway from sponsors on the one hand to regulators on the other. And I say this because in the article by Sanofi, what was apparent is that the vast majority of patient experience data, which includes advisory boards and also includes COAs, clinical outcomes assessment measures, is that actually the vast majority of patient experience data is communicated by sponsors for regulatory review, and that of what is communicated, about 60% is actually COAs. Actually, I'm sorry, but about 73% is actually the COAs. And of those, the vast majority is patient-reported outcome measures and not other COAs. So there's a lot that's being communicated by industry, but I felt like it just wasn't enough, because if it's on us to report this, then how can we do better? Such an effort would truly bring the patient perspective into drug development and regulatory decision-making. And I know that the FDA and other regulators are very receptive, including the guidance document that came out last week. It's like, as a colleague said yesterday, it's like pushing on an open door. And I love that analogy because there is so much receptivity in improving this communication pathway and maximizing the voice of patients in drug development. Patients and patient organizations really shouldn't have to repeat the same message over and over to each stakeholder in the drug development process. Sometimes, though, the biggest barriers are within our organizations, and Wendy will discuss next as she presents the findings of the interviews and the work to date, some of those learnings and some emerging good practices. We've built in opportunities, as Nicola said, for all of you to provide your thoughts and your insights, and we look forward to working together on next steps.
Thanks so much, Jessica, and for that kind introduction. And thank you, Nicola, for getting us off on a great start. I'm pleased to say that Eleanor, our other panel member, has joined by phone. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Wonderful. Okay. Deloitte is very pleased to have this opportunity on behalf of PFMD, NHC, and Takeda to share valuable insights obtained from experts across several organizations and associated with patients and drug development. And as we share these insights and interview findings with you today, we are asking for your feedback. Now, I know that we're all virtual and it would always be better to be in person. I know that everyone is stretched thin these days, and of course, we're all facing the challenges of the COVID pandemic. Some of you, I know, will be tempted to get distracted, and others will be multitasking. It is expected. And of course, we have data readouts, and they, by their very nature, can be boring. So we have the challenge of data and distance. We have the double D that we're dealing with today. But even though this may not be the most most exciting combination. I am coming to you today, not just as a scientist or as Nicola and Jessica shared as a former FDA or myself and a former sponsor. And of course, today I'm serving as your moderator. But I come to you today as a patient myself, and I'm asking you to participate. This is me here just yesterday, actually, at the Duke Cancer Center, where I receive my regular cancer treatments. And so I'm asking you from patients like me to please share your feedback today and in subsequent sessions so that we can benefit from a more robust communication pathway with regulators toward the goal of the development of safe and effective drugs. So I am vested. I know you are vested to carrying on this conversation and getting the patient's voice in medical product development. So let's get started, shall we? Next slide. So as Jessica alluded to, we conducted 35 interviews over the past few weeks from various organizations. They're listed here on this slide. The ones that are grayed out at the bottom under patient organizations are being scheduled as we speak, and we hope to follow up with them. We also heard from other nonprofit organizations as well as biopharmaceutical companies. If we further break out how the constituents within the biopharmaceutical companies were arranged, we see that you see here that about a fifth of them from the sponsor organizations came from the regulatory functions, and about equal amounts of R&D and patient engagement staff were involved in these. And we attempted to get a wide representation or a broad sampling on the topic of patient engagement and the use of patient experience data in regulatory submissions. From these 35 interviews, we obtained insights on current practices and gaps, or what we call challenges, and of course, future opportunities. Now, today we'll share these insights on what these participants see as challenges and emerging good practice. Let me just spend a second to see how we're defining those, if you can go back for a second. So for challenges, we're considering inconsistencies or hurdles in patient engagement practices, both challenges in developing qualitative and quantitative patient experience data across the industry, and of course, the challenge of communicating with regulators. And the definition we're using for emerging good practices are approaches or methodologies within biopharma. And I say biopharma because we spoke with folks in the biotech industry as well as pharma on where patient engagement team felt empowered to include the voice of the patient in drug development. And we'll also share the approaches that they've been using to communicate with the regulator. We also heard some potential future practices, and while we may not get into those discussions today, we'll save those and share those with you in a subsequent session, perhaps in July or September. So as we identify the challenges and the emerging good practices, I wanted to share with you some of the samplings of what we heard. Now, this is by no means a comprehensive report. In terms of challenges, we heard from one participant that the PRO pathway, while it is well developed, other outcomes assessment measures are less developed and perhaps considered to be less popular. So there's a big hurdle to get support for development of these new tools. We also heard as a challenge really across several participants that there still seems to be a gray area in understanding what regulators want in terms of patient experience data. And that goes beyond just PROs. For emerging good practices, we see, and we have heard, as Jessica alluded to before, that the FDA appears to be complimentary about sponsors joining and joining their efforts and going to the agency early. However, we also heard that there are varying degrees of acceptance for this early engagement, depending on the reviewing divisions that you go to. Some reviewing divisions are willing to engage, while others perhaps not so much. And I'm seeing a lot of virtual nods of the head here. We'll get into that a little bit more. Next slide. And so what we've done is we've sort of categorized the feedback that we've heard into 4 main themes. And you can think of these themes as the building blocks on which we added the challenges and the emerging good practices. I'm sorry, I apologize. I am a biochemist, and so I had to throw in this analogy here of amino acids being the building blocks of proteins. But if we look at how we define these 4 themes, and in the plenary session, for those of you who joined earlier, one of the speakers talked about culture and the need for a change in the culture and our thinking. So when we look at culture, we're looking at the assumptions or notions that influence patient experience and patient engagement and the use of patient experience data. So for instance, some of the questions were, is there buy-in from leadership? Is there a rigid culture internally where people are sticking to old, perhaps more safer ways of doing things and perhaps not engaging the patients in drug development? For cross-organizational alignment, we define that as the infrastructure within R&D and other functions that facilitate or perhaps might impede collaboration on patient engagement activities and patient experience data development. So questions, for instance, such as, are the therapeutic areas aligned in how they engage with patients and how do they generate data for submission? As we look at process, we define that as frameworks to integrate patient engagement and develop patient experience data in R&D for submissions. So are there key performance indicators within your organization, as those described by Jessica earlier, to really develop the right type of data for submissions? And then lastly, the theme of tools, we define that as instruments or platforms or techniques for patient engagement and for the generation of the right type of data in clinical trials for submission. So are there tools to generate the type of data needed for innovation and for regulatory submission? So we had a question in the chat box. I happened to see they were asking for links. Here you go. We thought of you before you even asked the question. These announcements were made just last Wednesday from the FDA and clearly demonstrates that FDA is willing to engage the patient's voice in submissions. I'll take the one on the right of the screen first. This is the announcement of the publication of the final guidance, and this is the first of 4. As many of you may be aware, FDA has been developing 4 guidances in a stepwise manner on how sponsors can collect and submit patient experience data and other relevant information for regulatory decision making. These 4 guidances and the PFDD efforts under the 21st Century Cures Act really demonstrate FDA's commitment to this effort. And so like most of you, I encourage you, this makes wonderful nighttime reading. That's when I read all my guidances. So I encourage you to go to that link at the top and download that new document. On the left of the screen, we also see an announcement for a public meeting under PDUFA 6 commitments, which is an independent, where an independent third party, in this case, Eastern Research Group, will present on FDA sponsor communications during the IND stage of drug development. Again, demonstrating that FDA is committed under PDUFA 6 requirements to assess and, more importantly, to improve FDA sponsor communications. Now, how timely is that? As we were preparing over weeks for this presentation and this session here with you, that the announcement will be made. I do encourage you to go and sign up for this meeting. It will be on August 11th. And there's limited space. I already signed up myself and my team, even though I didn't even ask them yet. So now we want to hear from you. We will be at various time points giving you the opportunity to provide feedback and your responses through a series of polling questions, as well as the opportunity to chat with us and submit questions or feedback through the poll. So I encourage you to do that. And let's get into the data here. So please drop questions in the chat window or when you have the opportunity through the poll. So when we looked at some of the challenges and the emerging good practices, next slide, please. I want you to think of the internal culture within your organization as made up of different flavors or colors, such as those represented here. by these very colorful umbrellas. Each umbrella could represent a team, a specific therapeutic area, a function or a business unit, and each one has its own assumptions or notions of how patient engagement should be done and how patient experience data should be used. The ultimate goal, the way I see it, is to get everyone under one umbrella, that patient engagement is necessary and that the generation of the right type of patient experience data should be an important part of every submission package, and that the patient's voice is critical in drug development. So when we look at culture and we look at the feedback that we got, we looked at sponsors' internal operations. We saw that some of the challenges internally within the biopharma industry was sticking to tradition. Across R&D, the therapeutic areas use traditional approaches, standard operating procedures, if you want to call them those, and perhaps some are not willing to incorporate the patient's voice in drug development. And the reason, we don't want to speculate here, but what we heard was that for one of the reasons is that there still seems to be a gray area on what FDA wants or is willing to accept, and therefore sponsors are playing it safe rather than risking rejection. We also saw isolated patient experience data being collected, but there are differences in what the perceived value of those data are. The value placed on early patient engagement and on the use of these data vary within across R&D and within the therapeutic areas. So as you look across the functions, we find differences on how these data are being collected or whether or not they're being collected at all. We also saw and heard from participants about being risk averse. Therapeutic areas are unsure of what to provide to regulators beyond PROs, and probably because PROs have a well-established regulatory path for their development and validation. So only tried and tested approaches are being used, and the reason for that is because some are not willing to take the risk of rejection by the regulators. When we looked at some of the emerging good practices, we saw that without exception, the organizations that have leadership buy-in or support from their leadership develops and results in consistencies across R&D on how patient engagement practices are adopted and how patient experience data are developed. Across R&D, use of PED results in driving greater awareness and adoption across all the therapeutic areas. And with a patient engagement roadmap, we saw examples of where the development of clear, proactive patient engagement efforts are really pervade through the entire organization. And the way data are collected is done with the end game in mind, so the goal of regulatory submissions. When we looked at the culture, within culture, what happens when sponsors interact with the external environment. These are experiences that they shared as they interacted with patient organizations, with other groups, and with regulators. We saw and we understand that the rules of engagement for patients and sponsors is a very tenuous one. Patients have to be, and sponsors have to be very careful that they're not seen to be unduly influencing patients. And this is particularly challenging in the rare disease space where there are fewer patients and smaller patient populations, for example, for recruitment efforts in clinical trials. We also saw one of the challenges as being sticking to the status quo. Internal regulatory teams, for example, don't want to push the boundaries with regulators, and so they are playing it safe, and new approaches to patient engagement and the development of clinical outcome assessment measures and tools are still not being pioneered. There's a perceived inconsistency in sponsor filings, and that again is the apparent hesitation from regulators in accepting, and this is at the division level now, within the reviewing division, that there is a hesitation, depending on which division you're dealing with, to accept and be open-minded. And so I do want to mention here in the challenges that it is recognized that the regulators and specifically FDA the leadership is very encouraging and is welcoming to the incorporation of the patient's voice in drug development, although not all the divisions are aligned and they're not formally linked. So the director's office and the separate patient engagement teams are not necessarily connected and formally linked to the reviewing division. So depending on what faction you deal with within the regulatory agency, you may get a different response. As emerging good practice, we saw that the patient groups, the patient advocates, and the patient organizations do serve a very good role in being the neutral ground territory for regulators and sponsors to obtain feedback from patients. And we also heard that attending the listening sessions with regulators can be very insightful and helpful. Contributing novel perspectives is also seen as a good practice as sponsors engage with the external community. And there is and appears to be a growing evolution in the willingness of regulators to accept patients' insights. Next slide. When we looked at patient organizations, what they see as some of the challenges include the fight, it seems, or the disconnect between sponsors struggling to understand the benefit risk evaluation beyond measurable insights. And as we heard earlier from Jessica, the example of Friedreich's ataxia and also for in celiac disease, the gluten burden, where the burden of the disease influences the patient's willingness to take risks, for instance. In cancer, I know that is definitely the case. And so depending on the burden of the disease, patients may be willing to assume or tolerate a higher risk for incremental benefit. And that choice may skew the benefit risk equation in a way that may not be conventionally acceptable by the regulators. However, it is a preference that some patients are willing to take. And the challenge then is, how do we quantify this patient preference data in a way that informs regulatory decisions? In terms of good practices, what we saw across the board are that early and frequent patient input is helpful in informing these efforts. Developing early and ongoing working partnerships with patients and patient groups helps with recruitment efforts within clinical trials, and also having the patients provide feedback that will contribute to the design of these clinical trials is always a good practice. Opportunities to act as intermediaries is where a lot of the patient groups appear to see themselves functioning to move this conversation further, collaborating with the sponsors on defining, for instance, what are valuable clinical outcomes assessments for patients, and connecting with the regulatory agencies early, encouraging patient engagement and helping to drive how we use patient experience data and what patient experience data to include in these regulatory submissions. So as we move on here, I'm going to pause at this point. I have been doing a lot of talking. We do want to get your feedback. We're just going to keep here the taglines of what we just discussed in terms of the culture and the challenges that we see in the sponsor organizations, both in their internal operations and as they interact with the external environment, as well as the patient organization. So please, of these, select your top 3 culture-related challenges. If you can go to the polls, the same polls that Nicola, there we go. Wonderful. Very interesting results just right off the bat. And so we'll take these outputs and we will use these to inform our panel discussions later on in this session. Excellent. Let's move to the next slide, please. We're going to also encourage you to add any additional culture-related challenges that you see in your organization. So the next theme that we are going to be talking about is cross-organizational alignment. And so as we talk about cross-organizational alignment, I want you to keep in mind that we're defining this as the infrastructure within R&D and other functions that either facilitate or impede collaboration on patient engagement and patient experience data. So basically, when it comes to PE and patient experience data development, everyone in the organization needs to be rowing in the same direction. We all need to be aligned in these efforts. So what we saw as challenges when we looked at cross-organizational alignment is that there appears to be still siloed functions. There's a lack of collaboration and communication between the teams, whether they are patient engagement teams, the clinical teams, and regulatory teams. There still appears to be some siloed operations happening. There's also a lack of cross-functional patient engagement leadership that can lead to varying results and disjointed patient engagement efforts, and in some cases even a lack of a plan or a roadmap on how to engage patients. We also saw the concept of autonomous TAs, where each therapeutic area is driving its own clinical trial processes. In some cases, there's appeared to be no centralization of these patient engagement activities. And depending on the diseases, patients are involved, and in other diseases, they're not involved, especially when there's no proactive roadmap on these activities. This lack of coordination and centralization of these activities appear to be leading to a significant amount of duplication of efforts and wasted resources. However, we found some good emerging practices, and we saw that cross-functional collaboration between R&D and the regulatory teams, frequent consults between these functions on defining the clinical outcome assessment measures and tools, created more informed submission packages and briefing books for regulators. Another emerging good practice was the concept of having a patient engagement specific role, and some refer to it as a patient officer, the creation of a centralized role with primary responsibilities for coordinating patient engagement efforts and generating and using patient experience data in regulatory submission. And of course, setting up a PE task force was one idea that would help identify opportunities to increase the use of patient experience data in development of medical products. Next slide. As sponsors worked externally with the outside environment, including the regulators, some sponsors and patient organizations saw a lack of clarity in what regulators will accept as qualitative and quantitative data. And in many cases, it was unclear what the value of these data would be in regulatory decision-making, and therefore resulted in this vicious cycle of not knowing what to present to the regulator, regulatory feedback not being helpful in developing those data, and it was just a loop that seems to be happening. One of the observations that we saw repeatedly as we conducted these interviews was the feedback that there are differences across the divisions. Varying reviewing divisions have differing degrees of willingness to engage early with sponsors and accept patient experience data in submissions. And so sponsors saw a willingness in some cases with the leadership within the regulatory agency being welcoming, but then getting to the divisions, perhaps not so much willingness to accept these data. And as we looked at some of the emerging good practices, we saw that sessions with regulators discussing patient engagement activities appear to be very helpful in these activities, and consistency in internal messaging within the sponsor organization and the patient organizations, and also consistency in messaging internally for instance, within FDA with the leadership and the reviewing division, so that you can adopt uniform practices across the agency with both the leadership and the reviewing divisions having the same concept of the importance of patient experience data in informing regulatory decisions. When we looked at patient organizations, we saw that the concept of individual patient bias still seems to be existing, and patient organizations recommending broader community engagement, and we'll see this emerging good practice coming up again, where the challenge appears to be that the patient's view of their disease is specific to their individual experiences, and so limited patient input in clinical trial design does not give a broad understanding of the disease. We also saw that one of the challenges being disease agnostic clinical trial design, where some sponsors develop trials without the patient input, and these generic trial designs, if you want to call them that, doesn't cater to the specific disease needs, and therefore there are different benefit risk metrics that appear to be developed where the side effects, the clinical benefits, and the outcomes are not accurately measured. We also saw misaligned metrics where there's an over-reliance on PROs, for instance, and less attention being paid to other measurements or tools. In terms of emerging good practices, we saw that regular engagement with the patient community is extremely helpful, particularly understanding the impacts from events. We're now all dealing with the COVID pandemic, and so understanding, for instance, how this pandemic is impacting patients, their participation in clinical trials, their compliance with medications, their doctor's visits, that ongoing community engagement with the patient community is extremely helpful. And establishing formal patient communication pathways, such as patient advisory boards, are very, very helpful in informing these efforts. So I'm going to encourage you now to go to your polls and please select the top 3 cross-organizational alignment related challenges as you see it from your perspective in your organization. Excellent. And we'll give a couple more seconds to look at the responses, and then we will move to the other theme, which is process. Thank you so much for your active participation in these efforts. Clearly, the challenge of having siloed operations is being seen as still one of the greatest hurdles internally within organizations. And so let's go to any other challenges that you might see in your organization that's not represented here. Are there other cross-organizational alignment challenges that you see? Please go and type those responses into the text boxes provided. Excellent. And so we're more than halfway through. I appreciate everyone's participation and staying engaged. Let's move on then to processes, and we are capturing your responses. These responses will be used shortly in the panel discussion and will also be incorporated into subsequent sessions, perhaps in July or September, so you will be seeing the responses. They are all anonymized, just to remind everyone. So let's move on then to process. The third theme that we encountered as we interviewed these participants, and we're defining that, as you recall, as the frameworks to integrate patient engagement activities and develop the right type of patient experience data in R&D for submissions. And I keep stressing submissions because at the end of the day, if we don't have these products, these drugs, these biologics, these medical devices approved for use by patients, we have lost the game. Next slide, please. Here we see again the theme of siloed approaches across therapeutic areas as being very high on the list of challenges, and varying levels and degrees of adoptions of patient engagement efforts, and inconsistency in developing and using patient experience data in submissions. Those themes were present throughout most of the interviews that were conducted. There's also inconsistency in the interpretation of guidances, and therefore, if they cannot be understood and are not found to be fit for purpose, those recommendations were not being incorporated into clinical trial design. And so emerging good practices included increased communication within R&D and the therapeutic area to allow consistent adoption of the type and quality of patient engagement practices, and the incorporation of the right type of data in their regulatory submissions. Again, we saw the theme of that centralized function of patient engagement leader, as a patient officer was mentioned several times across R&D, to provide those consistent approaches across the therapeutic areas and the regulatory functions. Next slide, please. In terms of the external challenges that sponsors experience is a lack of dedication of communication pathways for patient engagement, the absence of those fit for purpose type discussions with sponsors and regulators. Some of the conversations with the regulators were too general and didn't really provide that fit for purpose discussion. There were also examples where sponsors were unclear as to what type of meetings they ought to be scheduling with regulators, because the set check-in meetings, say end of phase 2 meetings, were 1 hour long, and there was not sufficient time to really get into the value of the patient data. And so do we go to a type C meeting, for instance? All of those things were discussed. And so one of the things that was observed was that sponsors are seeing that regulators are sometimes sticking to their old standard operating procedures in what approaches they use and what data they're willing to accept. And so there was a lack of understanding of meaningful patient experience data, for instance, incorporated into regulatory submissions. Next slide. I won't spend too much time on the emerging good practices here, but let's talk a little bit about what the patient organizations saw as challenges. When they deal with the and collaborate with the sponsors, there appears to be every sponsor and organization having a different approach to how they identify and recruit patients, and that the traditional approaches outweigh the innovative approaches. So I'll pause here. We have one more theme to finish. And so if I can just indulge you for a couple more minutes, I'm going to ask you to select your top 3 process-related challenges. I'm going to leave the taglines up here for a few seconds and go to the polling and select your top 3 as you see it from your perspective. It's very important to get your feedback, because these will inform future efforts, as you will hear Eleanor speak of later on in the session, but also to inform our panel discussion. So we welcome your feedback on the poll as well as the chat. Do I have everyone's permission to continue? So I see some positive responses here. Excellent. Let's move ahead and we'll keep recording these, keep recording the feedback that we're getting. Excellent. And so the last theme that we identified from the feedback that we have gotten thus far in the interviews was the theme of tools. We define that, as you recall, as instruments, platforms, techniques for patient engagement and for the generation of the right type of patient experience data. And I keep honing in on the right type because we have seen instances where data are collected in a sort of randomized fashion and not particularly useful in informing clinical outcomes as well as regulatory decision making. Next slide. And this, my friends, hot off the press. This just came out this week from the FDA. I wanted to share this with you here. We have the link at the bottom of the slide. Encourage you to go and read up on this first of a kind pilot program to communicate patient-reported outcomes from cancer clinical trials. This initiative is called the Project Patient Voice. It was just announced this week and is a pilot that's being led out of the Oncology Center for Excellence at FDA. It is an online platform for patients and caregivers and healthcare practitioners to develop a catalog of patient-reported symptom data, a different kind. And the intent is to use this when healthcare professionals are discussing symptoms of treatments and side effects with patients. How is this different from regular labeling? As we know, the labeling is sort of a static document, and this patient-reported symptom data is an attempt to capture the patient's voice in real time. So I encourage you to go in and read that up. So let's get to our last theme here, which is the challenges sponsors experience internally in developing tools. There appears to be limited generation and application of patient experience data in general, and sponsors are sometimes not willing to innovate for the less understood clinical outcomes assessment measures. And so despite the patient-focused drug development efforts and the guidances, there still seems to be a lack of clarity about the type and the quality and the quantity of patient experience data that should be collected and how those are to be used in regulatory submissions. We're listing out here some of the emerging good practices that we encountered during the interviews. I won't spend too much time on this. It is clear that the interactive dashboards, including these elements listed on the bottom right of the slide here, appear to be very helpful in informing the development of medical products, and engaging with patients early in the process appears to help this. As we move to the external challenges that sponsors perceived, there seems to be still a lack of efficiency for the qualification and validation of clinical outcomes assessments and drug development tools. And I have to say that on a personal level, this was painful for me to learn, because the drug development tools guidance was the last guidance that I contributed to before leaving FDA. And to hear feedback that this process is now very cumbersome and time consuming was quite disappointing. But there seems to be an over-reliance on PROs, and regulators are appreciative of the incorporation of other types of data, but still they described it as being a gray area. Next slide, please. Here we see some of the, oh, that was just up for a second there. I won't go into all the details on the emerging good practices, but timely development of these data, reevaluation of the qualification and procedures for drug development tools is a very, very good thing to have, and developing feedback to sponsors using this template, some of these elements that are listed here appears to be very helpful. So I'd like you to go to your poll at this point and please select. Let's spend a second or two on what the challenges were seen by the patient organizations. There appears to be a lack of a standardized toolkit in terms of recruitment. We also saw that registries are being built, but they have limited interoperability. So lots of data are being collected, but they're not facilitating drug development. And so it's a melee of data that's collected over time, but they're not informing actual submissions. And so that seems to be one of the biggest challenges that patient organizations are seeing. Next slide. All right, so I'm going to kindly ask the participants to select of these challenges that we have shared with you today, the top 3 that you see from your perspective and from your organization. It appears that designing studies to provide usable data, I'm assuming here we also mean submission quality data, and the lack of standardized toolkits appear to be 2 of the biggest challenges that folks are seeing. All right then, are there any additional tool-related challenges that you see within your organizations that's not represented on this slide? Please go to the poll and input your answer in the text box. We will capture those and report those out subsequently. Any additional tool-related challenges that we have not discussed, please add them to the text box. All right, let's move on to the next slide. Folks are eager to get into the panel discussions, as am I, because we have an awesome panel and we have been fortified with many, many good questions for the panel. Are there any additional emerging good practices that you have found within your organization? Please put those in the text box. And we have one last remaining poll for you. All right, next slide, please. Thank you everyone for your feedback so far. Please add any additional emerging good practices that you have seen that were not represented here. And so now we come to the poll of all polls. We talked about the 4 themes that made up essentially the building blocks of the key elements of the data that we shared with you today. I'm going to ask you to select your top priority now. Is culture the biggest thing that you see that's either influencing or preventing patient engagement and the collection of patient experience data in your organization? Or is it cross-organizational alignment? Is it a lack of tools or inconsistent processes, the framework internally? Please select your top priority now. Well, Nicola, we started off this morning with one of the plenary speakers talking about the big challenge of culture within the organizations. We're seeing that about a fifth of our respondents agree with her, and that cross-organizational alignment appears to still be deemed as one of the most important things in this process of incorporating the patient's voice in drug development. All right, so I see the activity slowing down here, so we'll capture this. And yes, we recognize that when we say cross-organizational alignment, we can also change that up to be cross-organizational misalignment. So thank you for that piece of feedback. So at this point, I would like to welcome back Nicola and Jessica and Eleanor, who's now able to join us, and open up the panel discussions and invite everyone to continue submitting questions into the chat box. Our team is behind the scenes collecting those, and they're going to be sending those questions to me so that I can share those with the panel.
Thank you, Wendy. That was a great session. Really, really enjoyed learning about the insights that we've gained together and looking at the comments as they came pouring in. I'm wondering if we might give Eleanor a few minutes just to kind of give her perspective, since she's now able to join us, and from San Francisco, theoretically.
My apologies for being late. Can you hear me okay, Jessica?
Yes.
Okay, my apologies for being late. My travel did not work out as I had planned for it to work out. And so I'm actually here in a train station. Not in San Francisco, but I thought that the San Francisco background was better than the Amtrak background. So thank you all. I have been on for most of the time, even though I did arrive late. And I was monitoring the chat as we were going, and I have to say that I believe it was Lode who said cross-organizational structures is part of culture. And I think I also too think of many of the barriers and challenges that we run into as being kind of stemming from culture, and that when we peel back that cultural layer, we see lots of things underneath it. But I think that's what this project is all about. It's about helping us figure out what those things are that we need to overcome, and then all of those opportunities, because we're seeing some best practices and how we can take those opportunities, we can leverage them, we can get them out to everyone so that they can learn from them. And that's really where we want to go with this project. And so it's very exciting to see the way that people voted and the engagement that we had. And it's exciting to think about how we want to move forward with this project in the future.
Terrific.
Sorry if you're hearing an Amtrak announcement in the background.
Right. We may need to have you mute intermittently.
We also, for the panel members, we're inviting Jim Elliott and Neil Bertelsen to join our panel discussions later on, because they can help inform some of these efforts and weigh in on efforts that are currently ongoing to make sure that we're incorporating the patient's voice. So we'll open it up to them as well.
Thank you, Wendy.
So I want to turn it over to each of you. I'll ask Nicola and Jessica and then Eleanor. Were there findings from the interviews and insights that were particularly important or stuck out to you as being important? And if so, why? Let's start with Eleanor first.
Sure. I think there was a theme in terms of best practices where organizations that thought that they had someone who had leadership over patient engagement activities was something that was important to having a good practice. I can see why that would make sense, because I think it shows that the organization is dedicated and has dedicated resources and infrastructure to doing this, and that is in all likelihood they're also communicating about it across the organization. So I think that that is an indicator that just having that position, having a person in that position, having some staffing, resources dedicated, it is also an indicator. It's a sign that the organization is thinking about this in a maybe long-term and constructive way, and that we should probably get a little bit more granular on that, drill down into that, and find out a little bit more about what are the things that are correlated with that, or what are the things that accompany having a dedicated resource, and how that makes it work, and how that makes it a best practice, and how that could be strengthened.
Thanks, Eleanor. Jessica, from your perspective.
Yeah, to build on that.
Out to you?
Yeah, I think to build on that perspective, it'd be interesting as well to hear from our workshop colleagues about what they see as some of the pros and cons for how that position or that centralized center of excellence or function is situated within the organization. Because I think about the aspect of the process needing some internal education in R&D, and these themes really cross over with one another. The way I'm interpreting that comment is that not everyone within R&D in a sponsor organization understands the external perception by regulators, the landscape that's rapidly evolving in patient engagement, and is rowing together on bringing insights that are gained in the organization externally to regulators. I think that also speaks to the culture that we have some risk aversion, and not everybody is on the same page with the comfort level with perceived risk, and then the cross-organizational alignment that we're still siloed. Each of these majority responses or largest cluster of responses really feed into my perception and based on a lot of experience internally, that what we discover in R&D and then try to communicate with regulators in some areas is communicated more than in others. And if we knew what the result or the value was to regulators for getting certain information or evidence, and I'm not just talking about patient-reported outcomes, because that's only one part of the patient experience data picture, but if we knew how it would be received and the value, it would also help us to align internally so that we can bring the right information at the right point in time to that external communication.
Yeah, it's interesting that you should mention that, Jessica, because there, the perception is that there are siloed operations within industry and within sponsor organizations in particular, and siloed operations within the regulatory agencies themselves. And we saw that that comment came across several times consistently. So let's turn to Nicola now in terms of what stuck out to you in terms of the data that we received.
Thank you, Wendy. So the way I look at it is more like from a patient engagement generalist point of view. And I was looking at what are the issues that actually are not specific to R&D or not as specific to patient experience data. And actually on the cultural shifts, it's really not a specific issue here. And so I know through the industry side of PFMD membership, I've seen a couple of good recipes actually to start the shift towards more patient engagement, and in this case leading to patient experience data. This notion of risk of engaging patient, because it takes time, because it costs money, because it's difficult. Actually, there is a shift that has been initiated in some companies stronger than others, and I understand there are still silos in each company. But it's a shift from risk of engaging patients to the risk of not engaging patients. And that's because of, it's also because of the regulatory moves in the US with the FDA, but also there is a follow-up on the European side, and EMA is announcing its new strategy 2025, and actually has presented already the top line for this strategy. of patient engagement for the European regulator. And so one of the key messages, because initially when we started PFMD, I was like trying to convince about the value of patient engagement and so on. And now actually, I'm not trying to convince about the value. I'm talking about being performant. And so being performant in your job, whether you're a regulator, whether you're a company, if your company is even being competitive, and not only being more competitive than others, it's just to be in the competition or not to be in the competition in a few years from now, if you don't engage properly the patient. So for me, these two elements are totally true in this context for the cultural shift we are looking for. And that's not specific to the patient experience data. I noticed as a second point, I think it was Elizabeth Cunniff putting that comment in the chat, that actually there is also very often in post-launch activities, many inputs that could actually inform, that do, or could, or that are used or not used, that's what I try to mean, but they can be a loop back towards R&D after post-launch for the next molecule in the same therapeutic area. And so I think that's a very important, we have to build from the information and the best practices where they are. And so that's why I'm very, still from a journalist point of view, that's why I really want to understand how what we will do here for patient experience data is actually valid for patient experience data across the life cycle of medicine, not only for R&D, and how we can connect that to other topics. So that's why I'm happy if we can hear a little bit more about Neil, from Neil Bertelsen and from Jim Elliott, that are trying to work on that to connect to this data going to HTA phases, and also to understand maybe from Jim a little bit more, like from the public health authority in Europe perspective, what would be the status, because we have been hearing a lot about the US, and so maybe just hearing a little bit more about the European side would be good. So voilà. And last point, I noticed the comment about the lack of not enough patients that can actually engage with the regulator in terms of expertise. And I noticed in the votes in the end, actually, it was not super high. It was very introvert on the regulator side or the organization like industry. But there was, in terms of the votes, I didn't see, at least, maybe I missed it, but I didn't see as a priority. I don't know if there is anyone from Upati fellow in the audience, but if you have anything you would like to contribute to that discussion, I would be really interested to hear what you have in mind. But an expert patient that would like to engage on that topic, that would be interesting. Via the chat or raise a hand as you want.
Nicola, this is Eleanor. I made a comment about that in the chat because while I think it's really important for patients to actually have some of those additional skills, and that it's important that we build capacity in the patient community to be able to engage in these kinds of things, I think we also have to look at the reverse side of it, and that the researchers, the scientists, the regulators, they also need that kind of training in order to be able to actively engage and appropriately engage, meaningfully engage with patients, and that we have to avoid trying to put all that burden only on the patients, because it's both sides that have to have more experience and capacity building in order to work together in a better way, and not have it just be, oh, those patients don't know enough, or I can't find patients who are already trained. I don't think we always want patients who have a tremendous amount of training. We also lose something when that happens too.
And if I can, go ahead, Jessica.
Go ahead, Nicola.
No, I just
Nicola
wanted to
first,
build on.
And then Jessica.
Thank you, Wendy. So I just wanted to
I
build
have to
on.
break up the fight here a bit, you know, because you're still chomping at the bit.
So just building on what Eleanor just said. So basically, I witness that all the time. We comment on the patient capacity to engage, but actually I don't see any stakeholder which is fully equipped to adequately engage with patients, organization, patient experts. We have solved contract issues recently, or we hope we are solving it with templates, but actually in the exchange, in the expectations, in the beliefs that there are really things that are not the right expectation even before we start the engagement. And so I think it's a really important point to make, that actually no stakeholder is fully ready and equipped now to engage with patients. It's not only the patients that are not ready to engage with the regulators. And that's a very important point. I witness that nearly every day.
And so, Jessica, if we could have your comments, and then I'd like to throw another question out along these same lines.
Yes. I really agree with what you're saying, Eleanor, that there's definitely a need to engage with people who are expert in living with their condition, and they don't need expertise in drug development. Although I think, you know, the UPATI training is excellent, and there is a need for engaging with patients who also understand drug development. There's so much need to have people who are not so knowledgeable, and that experience is really what we're seeking. And we depending on the question that the team is wanting to ask, we bring together the right mix of individuals and perspectives to address those questions, whether they be patients or care partners or patient experts. It really depends on the context of that engagement. There was a point I just wanted to clarify on why we started with the engagement with FDA. There really are different routes that the EMA and FDA are looking at for bringing in that patient perspective. And so starting with the FDA in this work, that really was the focus. I would love to see broadening the work ultimately to include EMA and other regulators as well. So this is just a first step, but really important to be broader as well.
Good point you bring up. I mean, we do know that the regulators, the global regulators, are communicating between each other. And they're learning from each other in this process. If we can figure out how to get one thing right and then just translate that to other therapeutic areas, that would be lovely. I do have a question here that appears to be coming up, and it's based on some of the real-time feedback we got during the presentation earlier. And that was that we saw cross-organizational alignment being voted as the top priority theme. What do you think, panel members, is the reason for that? And so let's start with Eleanor in your train station.
I think of cross-organizational alignment in two ways. So I think cross-organizational alignment within an organization like the FDA, because I think we're not seeing that cross-organizational alignment yet. So we have some divisions that are really being responsive to the need for patient engagement. We have other parts of the organization that are not. And so having more standardization and cross-organizational alignment there would be, of course, be very beneficial. And I think perhaps as the first guidance is now final, and we'll be seeing the additional guidances coming out, that can really help in that regard. And then within the companies and within the patient organizations, being sure that there's cross-organizational alignment there too. You might see within a company a group that works on one therapeutic area maybe highly active in this area, but other parts of the company are not. And they're continuing to learn from one another also. So I think we have to think about this not as just one type of organization that needs cross-organizational alignment. They all need cross-organizational alignment. And so even with among the different stakeholder groups, we can't have good alignment across FDA and patient groups and companies if they're not together internally. It's stronger if they have good internal alignment and go outside the organization for alignment.
So true. And before I turn it over to Jessica and Nicola for their responses, when you talk about the challenge of cross-organizational alignment, sort of let's break that down a little bit. So within regulatory bodies, while the leadership might be quite encouraging and welcome the patient's voice, we're seeing a disconnect between the leadership and then the reviewing divisions, and also differences when you go from one reviewing division to another based on the disease states. So that's cross-organizational from the top down, and then even within the reviewing divisions. And then in parallel, your mention of the challenges within sponsor organizations, again, between therapeutic areas, and then between therapeutic areas as a whole and their regulatory function. The therapeutic areas may be willing and want to innovate and want to try new things based on the recommendations that they're getting from, say, FDA. But then what we've heard is that they go to the regulatory function and they go, nope, we've never done it like this. We don't want to take the chance. So just want to tease that out a little bit further for the benefit of our audience members. And
Yeah.
so with that, Jessica, take a crack. Why do you think that that particular theme came out as top in terms of challenges, cross-organizational alignment?
Yeah, I completely agree. You make some excellent points that really resonate with my experience. Everyone wants to do a good job. Everyone's very focused on the needs of the patient. It's hard to change culture, and as with one of the comments in the chat mentioned, you know, cross-organizational alignment is a lot about culture too. Wendy, you really hit the nail on the head when you said it's about aligning with leadership, aligning across therapy areas. In our experience, we have some therapy areas where there is the PRO development that is, or COA development, which is really strong. I think there's even more encouragement to go beyond the PRO and think about other COAs. That's not seen by FDA according to the patient experience data that's presented publicly. So a lot of opportunity to do more there. But one really important point that I want to bring out is that this isn't only about PROs and COAs. It's also the experience and the insights from patients that lead to us to think about the need for a new outcome assessment measure or amending an outcome assessment measure based on an advisory board or longitudinal advisors for the study teams that say, you know what, the symptoms that matter to us aren't even on that questionnaire. Or I don't understand the interpretation of this question. I would interpret it this way, but he's saying that he interprets it another way. These kinds of insights really help inform our request for doing things for a new tool that would be useful and better representing the patient perspective. And that's patient engagement in the development of tools like PROs. And I know that PFMD has a working group that's really thinking thoroughly about this. But that kind of communication then needs to go through our regulatory affairs colleagues, and they need to align on whether they think that there's going to be receptivity in that particular division. And it's an evolution. What we're hearing is from some of our therapy areas that there's receptivity and excitement from the FDA to come early, very, very early on, and not just at the point where you're ready to develop that tool, but to think about it from the outset. And that's really encouraging, but it's not consistently done, I think, across, you know, the pathway here. Within our organizations, that interest and support to bring the conversation up early and to consider it is something that is an emerging good practice.
Thanks, Jessica. Nicola, before we jump to you, I just want to recognize in my role as our moderator that we have two very special guests joining our panel. We have Neil Bertelsen and we have Jim Elliott. Thank you both, gentlemen, for joining. They are with PFMD. And so, Nicola, would you mind if we just give Neil and Jim a few seconds to introduce themselves and the very important work that they're doing?
No, I welcome that even. So go ahead. I see Neil on camera, so go ahead, Neil. Neil,
can you take yourself off of mute, please?
Thank you for reminding me. So my name's Neil Bertelsen, and so I'm involved with PFMD. We're very much interested in looking at this, this cross-pollination between the regulators and how they're looking at patient experience data and patient insights. And much of my work is actually with the HTA, so the Health Technology Assessment bodies. And I see them asking exactly the same questions. So this topic area is such a hot topic, and there's so much more to do, and I'm really happy to be here.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Neil. We will be calling on you, and I'll be directing questions to you if we have the time. Jim? Can you introduce yourself and let us know what work you're doing right now that is aligned with our discussions from today? Jim is also on mute. Okay, well, Jim appears to be having some technical difficulties here. We'll just turn over to you, Nicola, and get your response on that piece of data that we saw coming in real time with respect to cross-organizational alignment being the highest priority that was rated by our participants this morning. What do you think are the variables or the levers for that?
There are many variables for that. What I would like to comment on the fact that I think we are in a transition phase. So I think each organization starts to set clear accountabilities for that to happen. I can see the discussion. If I know less the FDA side of things. I will not comment on that one. I've heard that there are differences there as well. What I would say on the industry side is that there is clearly discussion on how to set accountabilities and responsibilities for patient engagement across the organization. And then there are different models with different roles and allocations. But clearly I can see this transition, and I can see this is not only a willingness issued either from the top or from somewhere else, but there is also a kind of implementation of it. We see trainings from homeopathy, from PFMD to come and to actually help everybody to become accountable, not only to know about it, but also to know how to implement it. So I think we are at the start of the shift. It's difficult to put a number on that, more precise than that, but I just would like to comment on the fact that I see these functions in each organization with a real mandate and a real accountability to it. And I would stop there.
Thanks so much, Nicola. Very insightful comments. Jim, are you able to hear us? And Neil, if you could turn your camera back on, please. Jim still is not able to, he's still on mute. So perhaps I'll move on to additional questions. And so one here that we received was, our participants are aware of some of the work that's ongoing, for instance, in Transcelerate. And the question that they have is, how might we learn from their efforts? What can we learn and incorporate into these patient engagement practices? Jessica, you alluded to some of that. Do you want to start off first? How are current efforts on patient engagement being the lessons learned? What is the best way to share that with the rest of the industry and with regulators?
Yeah, I am not a part of that effort, and I'm not aware that it is exactly on point. I think that there's a tremendous amount of information and nuance to this space that isn't always clear and apparent on the surface. For example, when the FDA guidance came out last week, a lot of individuals were concerned that the series of guidances would cover this. And it's very related, and it's extremely helpful at furthering the ball. But what happens in the guidance, for example, is that there's a step that is the report out, the very last step after doing the patient engagement studies, whether that be qualitative or quantitative, whether it be a COA or a focus group or an advisory board that's informing the study design or endpoints. The final step is analyze and interpret the data, and then the very last step is report study results. So that is where it leaves off in terms of how and when. But if we had the clarity through an enhanced kind of pathway, and all the collaborators, all the stakeholders could come together and say, yes, this works for us, or can we tweak it this way or that way so that it would be more valuable and we can act upon it, that would give us the ability to maximize the use of the insights. There was a comment in the chat earlier about should the FDA be hearing directly from patients and patient organizations to really have a more direct firsthand experience at hearing the insights from patients. similar, this is a model that's being used more by EMA. And my thought on that, from my perspective, and really interested in others as well, is that in industry, we need to engage patients to inform our decisions, and that needs to happen anyway. So why duplicate the efforts and have the FDA also getting that as their primary source of insight about the patient perspective? It can be both, but if we're doing the activity, why not be able to share in a way that's useful at a time that's useful, the insights we're getting that are informing our decisions on multiple different levels. Designing the study to have flexibility in the right ways to have underrepresented patients and increase enrollment and retention in studies that's going to help everybody get more medicines of value to patients sooner.
Excellent point, and that certainly would reduce any duplication of effort with patients, sponsors interacting with patients, and then patients having to interact with the regulators on pretty much the same topics, if you would, and the same diseases. Eleanor, I want to turn to you. Oh, Neil, yes, go ahead. You have a comment? Before you start, unfortunately, Jim could not stay on, so we lost Jim, but we have Neil. Neil?
Okay, thank you. So I just want to comment and sort of on the back of Jessica's last comment, because I think it's a really important point. We see different kinds of authorities using different kinds of engagement or data methods. So we see the FDA very much talking about patient experience data and very much looking to the industry to provide that data as part of their submissions. And you're right, Jessica, we see at the European Medicines Agency that they have a culture which is much more around patient participation in the committees and the decision making. In HTA, where they ask almost the same questions of the patient community, we see there the HTAs tend to go to the patient groups and ask the patient groups to provide the evidence to help them with their decision-making process. And I think it's really useful to just take a step back from all of these different processes and say, why are they doing this? Why in the first place are they asking for this information? It's because they want to make better quality decisions. And they know that having that patient perspective helps them make better quality decisions, whether they be regulatory decisions or health technology decisions. Now, they're going about it in different ways, and there's a lot of work that needs to be done to understand what is the pros and cons of those different ways. But I think if we hold on to this fact that everybody's doing this for the right reasons, to try and make the best quality decisions, however they choose to do that, we have to somehow work with them, find a way to streamline this, find a way to show which kinds of approaches work best in which kinds of situations.
Absolutely. And as we end on that note, Eleanor, I
actually wanted to add to that, Wendy, because
Sure.
I think one of the things that's really important is, again, I want to emphasize that the burden ends up falling on the patients and the patient groups. And so in any way that we can reduce burden, that's going to be something that's very valuable, especially when we talk about rare diseases and there are rare disease groups. They have a hard time capturing a lot of patients anyway. The numbers are small. They may have 10 companies coming to them at one time if they're a very small rare disease group. They can't handle that burden. And so we have to think and be creative and innovative about how that information gets captured and shared so that we can reduce the burden. They can't be responsive to every single audience that's out there and do a good and thorough job if there's just too many demands placed on them. That said, I think it's also important that we don't just capture information in one way from one audience. We need to be able to have the diversity, the representativeness of the patient population that we're talking about. And so I think it isn't bad that many different stakeholders are approaching patients and capturing this information. It's only bad if it's being siloed away in different places and we don't see a total picture of what's going on, because then maybe we have decisions being made on small tidbits of information and we haven't put all the pieces of the puzzle together. And so I think there are pros and cons here that we need to think about, but we also need to think innovatively about how we could do it.
So well put, Eleanor. I couldn't thank you enough and agree with you more. I mean, speaking not so much as your moderator today, but as a patient myself, we have to find ways to reduce the burden on these patients as we want them to be involved, but not making it duplicative or not making it difficult for them, because we'll see exactly what we see with dropouts in clinical trials. If the clinical trials become too burdensome, patients are not going to enroll. And if the therapeutic intervention is too burdensome or the side effects are too great, we will have zero compliance with medication. So absolutely agree with your comments in that regard. And so now I'll switch back to my moderator role and take off my patient hat here, but I just wanted to agree with you. Jessica, would you like to, we have one more question. We'll give you a chance to chat, and then Nicola, and then we'll take the last question. You want to comment on patient, because I know Takeda is very much involved and prioritizes patient advisory boards. Could you speak a little bit about the burden on the patient as Eleanor so eloquently described, and what you see?
Yeah, I think these are all really key points that you've mentioned. I don't have the need to add to that per se. What I do want to add to, though, is a perspective here on also the biotech companies that are small and have limited resources and headcount. If they had a clear pathway, they could engage more with patients and bring the patient perspective into their development. And what we heard from the biotech companies in this initial research was that they actually can't do any patient engagement because they don't really know the value of it in terms of their own decision making, but also, even more important, regulatory decision making. So if they knew what the end result could be and the impact it could have, they could more justify better understanding from a patient perspective whether we're measuring the right things and developing the right evidence to support patient decision making ultimately in healthcare delivery. Wendy, you're on mute.
Nicola, would you like to comment on that in terms of really leveraging the patient's voice in a manner and in a way that's not burdensome for them? Because we're going to be tapping into the same population, as Eleanor mentioned, with the disease population being relatively small compared to others. But we also have to look at things like including pregnant women in clinical studies and children. And so we cannot really burden those patient populations any further than they're already burdened with disease. Do you want to comment on that?
So yeah, so first a general observation, and coming back to this kind of not doing, when do we do this input from the patients? And it's not a one-off exercise, never. It's a permanent exercise, and that's why the point on post-launch activities was very important earlier today. And it's an ongoing effort, so that's the first thing. And I think the moment we recognize that, and we don't ask 50 times the same patient organization to do that, but also on the other side, the patient community organize itself to provide that in an ongoing way. So we have to do it on both ways. I think that would really help the whole process. And each time one of the stakeholders will move on and is not able to make the match with the expectations set by the patient community, that will be very difficult to move on. I think that's a reality. That's where the performance of all stakeholders come back into play. And then the last point I wanted to do is that I've seen a comment earlier saying that we were asking in industry if they wanted to talk to patients or to patient organizations. And it's very good to ask that to industry people. I would like to ask that question to patients. You know, how many patients want, on top of dealing with the disease, want to actually engage? So I think that's where I think there is in the puzzle of trying to address all the questions we try to address in patient engagement, I think we are missing big time a good framework to understand when do we need expertise, who needs to engage who, and in which order, and what's this, 10% to organization and all the rest of patients will come to industry? I don't believe that. So that's why I think that we have a huge progress to do, and maybe that's a piece of work we should be all thinking about, is how do we organize the roles to build this patient unmet need picture that we need to build.
Absolutely. Nicola, if you're asking for volunteers, I'm signing up right now as a patient, because you are so correct. Patients are dealing with so much, not just the burden of the disease, and using them and leveraging them in the right way to get their feedback so that we can inform regulatory decision making. How we do that is absolutely critical. So with that, what I'd like
and Wendy,
to
I would add to that, that's something that we should be asking patients. Patients should be telling us how they want to be engaged and what's the best way for them, so that we're building that, you know, as Nicholas has said many times, it's co-creation. And we have to have co-creation for engagement the way we want co-creation for everything else.
Very true. Well, we have unfortunately come to the end of our panel discussion, so I want to turn it over to Eleanor. At this point, we're going to pull the slides up for Eleanor. Panelists, if you could remain online, that would be wonderful. Neil, don't go anywhere. We have already lost one of my panel members, so don't want to lose another one.
So we're going to go back to our, if you could go to the next slide, please. I know we're starting to run short on time. We want to go back to the polling and just ask one very quick question. After all of the discussion that we've heard today from everyone and all of the data that Wendy showed us, I'd like to ask everyone in one word, would you please go in and type in that one word that comes to mind when we talk about patient engagement and patient experience data? Just one word. And if we go to the next slide, I think we can see what that starts to show us about what people are thinking about what they've heard in this conversation today and on all of the data that we've seen. I'm seeing great adjectives here. Definitely undervalued, the need for connectivity, its importance, it's essential. So wonderful, it's still growing. So feel free to keep adding to that as we go on to the next slide, please. And we'll collect those data and be able to show them to you later. Next slide, please. So you saw this slide a little bit earlier today, and this we're getting to the update on this. So we talked earlier about how today is for sharing and validating the current findings, getting some input from the group on this, because we really want to be able to shape where we want to go in the future with this discussion. So that gets us to that last green spot at the end of this little roadmap that we have here. And what we want to talk about for the future is, what do we do with this going forward? We at the National Health Council have had an approach to doing things where we build by starting with some small data collection, starting by talking to lots of different kind of stakeholders, and then build a pathway forward. And we see this chain of events that's gotten us to today as the starting point for that kind of pathway that we might be able to leapfrog forward and get some groups together, get a nice working group together to start thinking about this. So let's jump to the next slide and we can have a little bit more of a discussion about what that vision looks like for where we want to go with this. When we think about stepping off from today, getting a stand-up working group created, get key stakeholders together, do some more of the prioritization, the refinement of the topics, the gaps, and the opportunities to start to address these. And then looking forward, we'll look to something that we will do in September, where we actually then take it the next step, move forward from there, creating alignment on a roadmap, launch some pilot programs, and then think about what those other additional future steps are that we need. So what we're thinking about is this kind of right now, sketchy roadmap, but at least forming that working group to get this going. So if you turn to the next slide, we want to talk about what your level of interest is. So from the audience, as a potential member of this working group moving forward, what are the kinds of things that you might be interested in working with us on? Because we want more collaboration. So if you would check here the kinds of things that you would be willing to sign up for, that you would be willing to do, interested in being part of the co-creation efforts, stay on the distribution list. Maybe you don't have time to join us right now, but you want to be kept informed on the kinds of things that we're going to be doing. If you want to just be tapped periodically and you only want to provide input as needed, let us know about that. And if you just don't have time to be involved, that's okay too. We understand that everyone has a lot of competing pressures right now. So thank you. I think it looks like we have some great responses here and that a lot of people are very interested in being engaged. So if we go to that next slide, I want to ask that if you are interested in being involved going forward, then what we'd like for you to do is to put in some personal information next so that we'll be able to reach out to you. So keep in mind that for all of the questions that you've been asked today as part of this workshop, your answers were anonymous. We didn't collect any personal information from you. But if you would like to stay involved and if you would like to be engaged in this, we'll follow up from you. We'll follow up with you if you just would be willing to put in your name and your email to let us know that you actively do want to be engaged. And the next slide, I want to go to Wendy just to say, I'm going to turn it back over to her because I know she's going to ask the panel for some final comments.
Yeah, so Eleanor, thank you for that. And thanks for sort of paving the first few bricks on that road to the future. So at this point, what I'd like to do is, Eleanor did the word cloud. I'll be so generous, panel members, and give you more than one word. I'd like to give you each 30 seconds, starting with Jessica and then Eleanor. We start with ladies first, and then Neil, who was so kind to join us at the last minute, and then we'll close up. You have 30 seconds to give us your main takeaways from today's very delightful and active participation and productive session. So Jessica, 30 seconds.
All right, start the clock. I'm just really thrilled. I'm thrilled that there's so much interest and engagement. I'm thrilled that I've been able to partner with Nicola and Eleanor, and really, truly, Wendy, your knowledge, your passion for this space, and your excellent job presenting and your timeless hours spent. I really could not have done this without you. So what started as a kind of a vision and a need for more information, it's truly rewarding to see this collaboration. And I look forward to co-creating with so many of you, the 68% that said they want to continue to work on this. It's absolutely wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jessica. Eleanor, 30 seconds.
Well, my one word, if I had to say one word, was optimism, because I think, we've been quite a few years now down this road for patient engagement in drug development. And even 5 years ago, I believe it's 5 or 6 years ago now, we put out a report that said that we saw 3 barriers to us being successful in patient engagement in drug development. Those 3 barriers were culture, which again popped up today. The second barrier was communication. And I think a lot of what we talked about today are communication type barriers. And the third was regulatory guardrails. And I think we've seen improvement on regulatory guardrails. We are getting the guidelines now. We've seen improvement in communication. I think we're all doing a much better job of sharing information with one another, and that's moving forward optimistically. And culture, as I believe it was Jessica said earlier, is always the most difficult thing to tackle. And we have begun to chip away at it. And I think with the future of this project in moving forward, we're going to continue to chip away at those cultural barriers even more.
Thank you so much, Eleanor. Neil, 30 seconds, your key takeaway. You are our special guest that dropped in today, and we're so pleased to have your feedback and your comments and for you to be part of the panel. Please share your takeaways.
My one word is opportunity. So I see a massive opportunity here. I see an opportunity to take this data and, okay, use this data with regulators, but this data has legs far beyond the FDA. It has legs far beyond the EMA. It has legs into what happens afterwards when a product is on the market, when it's going through health technology assessments, when we're thinking about how to measure what changes happens in people's lives when they have new technologies available to them. So it gives us a baseline to work from that we can set at the beginning. And who knows what that information will tell us as we go through time. So the opportunities for this are endless, I would say, endless opportunities.
Absolutely, opportunities knocking at our door. Nicola, 30 seconds. And before Nicola goes, I'm encouraging folks before you leave to please give us your name and your email addresses so that we can follow up. Nicola?
Yes, I'd like to, so I'm first very enthusiastic about this discussion, and I would like to build on the notion that no stakeholder group, no player or no health system will be performant without engaging with the patients, and we have to build on that. We have to streamline what it means in terms of reducing the burden on the patient community, but we also have to empower the patient community to be And I say empower, not build capacity. It's really something we have to give rather than something we have to ask. And I think altogether we have an opportunity to solve the issue in PED and regulatory affairs, but also across the life cycle of medicine and beyond medicine as a whole, patient experience perspective.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for those comments. I would not be a good moderator if I didn't thank so many people behind the scenes, Colin and Kiara and Vivian. I want to just shout out to all of you, Candy Lurkin, who has been keeping us on time. Thank you so much. And thank you to my panelists and to the participants and to the interviewees. We have come here because of your feedback. We have shared with you what we've obtained. And as Eleanor said, we look forward to so much more opportunities to work together on this very important topic of patients in drug development. Thank you all so very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Take care.